I'm just walking around. Thank you all for coming tonight. It's nice to see you out here. The only thing to be better is if there are about 2 dozen bison out in the prairie. As Ray said, my name's Kurt Repanshek. I've been here in Park City for about 26 years. Not quite a native, but I'm working on it. I embarked on this project back in 2017. As Ray said, I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of National Parks Traveler, and I was in Washington at a National Parks conference, and encountered Dan Wink, who at the time was the superintendent of Yellowstone National Park. And he had been approaching the major national newspapers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, begging them practically to do a story about brucellosis in bison in Yellowstone. And brucellosis is a disease that can cause spontaneous abortion in livestock, cattle, elk, bison. And it's a big issue, continues to be a big issue in Yellowstone. And Dan was trying to convince the newspapers to do a big piece on exactly what the issue was and get all the stakeholders involved, the tribes and the state of Montana and the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Forest Service, as well as the state of Wyoming. And nobody would take them up on it. They said, we can't devote that much space to a story like that in our newspaper. We just can't do it. So well, Dan, behind burning these pixels and electrons, so I'd be happy to do it. And so I got in touch with an old colleague of mine, a journalist up in Wyoming, and we joined up to tackle the project together. And it was a fun project, and it's a project that really goes back quite a ways. The more I got into it, I went back about 200,000 years to when bison first came over from Asia via the Barren Land Bridge, which at the time was a bridge. The water was still low. And the bison came across the bridge, and they saw all these wonderful grasslands. This is incredible, look at all this food and forage and place to roam. And then they saw the locals, the American lions, the saber-toothed tigers, the Dyer wolves, and they realized that we're not alone here. And we got a hint of what these bison from 200,000 years ago looked like, thanks to a husband and wife team of gold miners up in Alaska. They were doing a process called hydraulic, where they would basically take this big fire hose out and shoot this high pressure stream of water at a hillside and try and erase all the overburden and the mud and rocks and hopefully expose gold ore. Well, they didn't immediately expose gold ore. I think this was in July of 1979, and as they were taking their hose back and forth across the hillside, all of a sudden this thing kind of protruded out from the hillside. They shut off the hose and walked over. Here's the rear hind quarters of this animal sticking out of the hillside, just kind of hanging there. And so they were kind of perplexed, as you can imagine, and they contacted the University of Alaska and got put in touch with Dr. Dale Guthrie, who was a paleobiologist. And Dr. Guthrie came out and had his boots on, and there's all this water and mud all over. He kind of walked up the hillside, looked up at the rear hind quarters of this animal, and was just astonished. I mean, it was like it was just put in the deep freeze yesterday. Muscles on, fur and whatnot, and it was starting to fall off. And so Dr. Guthrie managed to get it transported over to the University of Alaska, where they put it into the deep freeze. And then it went back for the front half. And when Dr. Guthrie was conducting the necropsy, which is basically an autopsy, to try and figure out exactly what happened to this bison, steppe bison, S-T-E-P-E, he found out a couple things. One is that he was not killed by an American lion, at least not immediately killed by an American lion. What he concluded from the scratch marks on the hide and the puncture marks was that the lion had definitely gotten a grasp on this bison, but somehow the bison got away. We don't know how it got away, but it got away and died someplace else and was quickly covered with material and locked in permafrost. Now, they nicknamed this creature Blue Babe. because there was a chemical reaction between the hide of the animal and the minerals in the soil and the fresh air that gave it a slightly blue tint. And of course, it was so big, they immediately thought of Paul Bunyan, his pet fox. And so what Dr. Guthrie surmised was that somehow this animal managed to avoid the lions and got away and died later. He took the front quarters back to the deep freeze and put it in, and after he was done with the meat processing, they brought in other taxidermists. And taxidermists put it back together. And if you search for blue-bayed bison on the internet, you'll be able to see a picture of it put back together. And one of the quirks about Dr. Guthrie here was he was so amazed by this pretty freshly preserved bison that he couldn't resist taking a couple of pounds of bison. And several years later, he had the taxidermist over and some friends, and they had some blue-bayed stew. It was 36,000-year-old bison stew. Wow. Not sure I would have done it, but it would have been interesting. What's amazing about this story, what's amazing about bison, there's so many amazing things, and I'll probably overuse the word amazing. But when Columbus arrived here in 1492, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service figures there were 65 million bison in North America. Now, I don't know if you can make out these lines here. This map was made by Dr. William Hornaday, and we'll get to him in a little bit. And this is a map that he created, guesstimating the extent of bison range at various times. And if you find this map, you can see he actually put years on it that say when the bison were here and when they were there. But basically, they extended from Canada down to the Rio Grande River in Texas, as far east as Virginia, some say northern Florida, out to Nevada, possibly even California. And it's just amazing that there were that many bison on the landscape. I mean, it would be like if you're driving from Cheyenne to Laramie, and every which way you look, there's bison. Well, if you drive from New York City down to Princeton, Central Jersey, everywhere you look, there's bison. It must have been a phenomenal image. I mean, so many head of bison. The military after the Civil War, when they went out west to the Indian Wars, I mean, they were talking about streams of bison miles long and miles wide that would take all day to pass by. It was just incredible. Now, of course, as we all know, that many bison just can't stand up to humans. And the 1880s was the 1800s was the period of the Great Slaughter, starting about mid-century, not long after the Civil War, when we started to expand the country going west. And you had the buffalo hunters who would go out there, and their main deal was they wanted to kill bison for the meat, the hides, and the skulls, and that's how they made their livelihood. And the military came out, they figured, well, the best way to put the Native Americans out of existence was to wipe out their commissary. And the bison was their commissary. And it brought them food, shelter, tools, and more. And there's going to be an image a little bit later on that shows all the different things that came from the bison that they used. Just phenomenal. And so the military had this unwritten code that we're going to kill as many bison as we can. And so they would actually give ammunition to buffalo hunters to go out and kill bison. And also accelerating the demise of the bison herds was technology. Because they were, in Germany, I believe it was, they were learning how to better tan hides, more quickly tan hides. And so all the buffalo hunter needed to do was kill the animal and take the hide. And so if you watched Dances with Wolves, and there's that one scene where Kevin Costner and the Lakota are looking over the hillside and drawing all these stripped bison carcasses. I mean, that's what they would do. They would go out there and use an incredible operation. You have your hunter, and you have a wagon guy, and you have a skinner. And they would just go out, and the hunter would just slowly shoot down the bison, and then the skinners would go out there and they would do the dirty work. And another use for bison. The bones were ground up in fertilizer. And I'm sure many of you have seen this picture, this nice pile of bison skulls that which could not be ground up for fertilizer. It's kind of astonishing what went on back in the 1880s. Now, I focused on four what I call saviors of the bison. And of course, there were many other individuals involved, but I thought these four were really kind of interesting. Charles Buffalo Jones, Charles Goodnight, William Temple Hornaday, and Theodore Roosevelt. And what's, I suppose, is not surprising, but what each and every one of them had in common was they killed bison before they turned into saviors for the bison. Buffalo Jones was a real interesting character. Crazy might be a good word to describe him too. He did all kinds of things. He grew up in Illinois in the mid-1840s, and his parents had a farm, and he helped with the chores and whatnot. And one day they were out in the woods cutting firewood, and he saw this squirrel in the tree, and he decided to go up and catch the squirrel. Can't imagine how he did it, but he did it, and he eventually tamed that squirrel. And one day he was walking through town with a squirrel on his shoulder, and this guy goes, "Man, that's a really cool squirrel. I'll give you 50 cents for that squirrel." And Jones was just flabbergasted. 50 cents, that's a lot of money. Sure, you can have my squirrel, I'll take you 50 cents. And so Jones, who had already developed a love for wildlife, now gained an appreciation for what wildlife could provide for him. So he later moved out as a young man to Kansas, and I think it was 1876, 1870, mid-70s. There was this incredible blizzard, and after the blizzard, he went out on the prairie and saw these dead cattle. They couldn't survive the cold and snow and whatnot. But he didn't see a single bison carcass anywhere. And so he came to realize that bison were incredibly hardy, kind of unruly at the same time. So maybe what I need to do is cross cattle with bison and come out with this hardy but amiable animal for livestock. So he did it for a while. It didn't work out as he expected it to work out. He let the bison go, the cross bison. We call them cattle. If you've been down to the north rim of the Grand Canyon, there's a bison herd down there. Buffalo Jones. I haven't seen him in person. I've seen pictures. I've talked to a Park Service biologist who have seen them. There's a few squirrely looking bison down there. They've got white faces like crow birds and don't have the hump that most bison have put down. So Jones was quite the character. He was always looking for a deal from the federal government. And he was always trying to talk me to give me some land so I can, set up these wildlife refuges. And he went to the Kansas congressional delegation a couple times and didn't have any luck with that. But lo and behold, his name got around, and as you know, the military was in charge of Yellowstone early on, before the Park Service arrived. And in, I think it was 1902 or so, Jones got a call. We need a game warden. We've got 23 bison that survived the Great Slaughter. We need to increase the numbers. So somehow they called up Buffalo Jones. He went up to the park, and he had his connections in Montana with some bison owners up there, and he had some connections with Charles Goodnight down in Texas, and he bought some bison from both of those operations because he was, somewhat aware of the fact that we need different bloodlines. You can't have all one bloodline in the herd. And so he was able to get bison from northern Montana and some from Texas, and it bolstered the herd. And he was there for a few years, and the herd successfully grew up, basically what we see today. But Jones didn't stick around too long. He was, like I said, a peculiar man, and he kind of roughed the edges of the military and the crews that he was working with, and so he was given his walking papers. Later in life, he must have felt he was the savior of everything. He went up to the Northwest Territories, I believe, because muskox were going downhill in population, and he figured out he'd go up there and get some muskox and take them to an island off the California coast Could be Channel Islands National Park today. And he was going to raise muskox and then take them back to Canada. And local tribes said, no, you're not going to do that. You might get back alive. And they sent that message across to them. And it's in the book what he did. And he let him leave. Charles Goodnight. Some of you might be familiar with him, the Goodnight Loving Trail, cattle trail that went out from Texas all the way up to Cheyenne. And he got to Texas as a young boy and grew up there and decided he wanted to get into the cattle business. And so he encountered a rich Irishman who was his benefactor. And Charles had to find a place to run the cattle. And so he went back to Texas, to the Texas Panhandle, I believe. There's a canyon there called Palo. It was a huge canyon. It had great grasslands and great water source. He figured this is perfect. You know, my cattle will be fine here. I can keep them contained. Won't be a big issue. Except for all these bison around there. And so he had to drive all those bison out of there and put his cattle in there. And his wife, you know, there's always a brilliant woman behind a successful man. She was Charles. I need to keep some of those bison and start your own herd on the side. And he did that. His main livelihood remained cattle. Like I said, him and all of our loving created the Goodnight Loving Trail went up to Cheyenne. And if you're Larry McMurtry fans, you know about the Lonesome Dove series, and that was basically based on what they were doing, driving cattle up north. And one thing about Charles, he was a brilliant man, self-taught, and he was really concerned about genetics. He was not as much knowledge as we have today about genetics and tracking them, but he was aware of adult lines and he wanted to have diversity. And so he would keep pretty good records about all his cattle and where he would get his goals from to expand his herd and whatnot. And he did that a little bit with his bison herds too. And he also tried to cross bison with cows. And in fact, he actually wrote a scientific paper that got into one of the science registers, talking about how he did it. They had lower standards back then as far as what got accepted for scientific journals. But I mentioned it in the book. And anyway, he did a pretty good job, but unfortunately after he passed away, they didn't do such a good job of keeping the genetics, and he started doing very well. The herd eventually passed out to the state of Texas, and it has run into some inbreeding problems, but I think we can work that out. William Temple Hornaday. He was probably a bigger hunter than all the others combined. He went to college and got a degree in taxidermy, and soon after he graduated, he went to work for a taxidermy company up in Rochester, New York. And they hired him to basically travel the world and kill things. And bring back the skins and whatnot, and they would produce mounts that were sold to universities and museums. And Hornaday actually traveled all over the world, killing things. In the mid-1800s, 1880s, he was the chief taxidermist at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. And around 1886, he was catching wind that there ain't going to be many bison in the West too much longer. And that was a concern for him because the bison exhibit they had at the Smithsonian was kind of beat up, kind of run down, wasn't going to last that much longer. And he realized, I better get some more bison if we're learning more bison to get. And so he went out, and long story short, he ended up killing, I think, about 22 bison and taking them back to the Smithsonian Institution for his mounts. And as the others, he was starting to realize, look at things in a different light. And he actually wrote this long treatise called The Extermination of the American Bison. He was starting to see what was happening to wildlife, and not just bison. He was concerned about all wildlife. He wrote another book that looked at all types of species and the dangers that they were facing. And his concern led him to the American Bison Society. And this was an interesting organization that, you know, a couple times, one day was asked to get involved with it, a couple times he said, no, I don't have time for it. And by now he was in New York, working for the New York Zoological Society. We know it better as the Bronx Zoo. Anyway, he finally agreed to work for the American Bison Society, and he pulled along Theodore Roosevelt to be honorary chairman. And another thing that amazes me about this whole story is, we pick up a phone, we text somebody, or we email somebody, or we just call them up, this little thing in our hand and hold it, and instantaneously we're in communication. I mean, these four men, Goodnight, Jones, Roosevelt, and Hornaday, all were in touch with one another. They're all exchanging letters and notes on Bison and whatnot. I mean, think how long it took. I mean, it was probably longer than a week for a letter across the country back then. But anyway, the American Bison Society, which today can be traced to the Wildlife Conservation Society, also out of the New York Zoological Society or the Bronx Zoo, did a lot of wonderful things. And one of the things that Hornaday figured out was that if we can get the federal government to give us land and fence it, we'll give them the bison to put on that landscape. And so in 1907, he got a promise from the federal government, okay, you tell us where you want it fenced up and we'll see what we can do about it. And so they sent one of their staff out, and the gentleman ended up in Oklahoma at Wichita Mountains Refuge, Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge. They said, this is a pretty good place. And so Hornaday went back to Congress and said, we found this place, Wichita Mountains, we fence it, we'll provide the bison. And so they said, sure enough, we'll do that. Sounds like a good deal to us. We want to pay for the animals. And Hornaday, back at the Bronx Zoo, had been collecting bison from the different private organizations that he knew had bison, including one up in New Hampshire. This interesting character had 160 head of bison in New Hampshire. He had a little game refuge. He was trying to bring animals from all over the world in. But anyway, so Hornaday at the Bronx Zoo had about 3 or 4 dozen bison. And he kept accurate track of all the different bloodlines to know which came from which. Was cognizant of not inbreeding. And so he sent 15 hand-picked bison out to Wichita Mountains. And that worked great. And they had this big affair in New York City. New York Times covered it. And he had this old cowboy who was so proud to be joining these bison on their trip west because it gave him something to do as well. A few years later, in 1913, Hornaday was at it again, and they sent their staffer out to search the West for some more landscape that they could turn into a refuge. And the gentleman ended up in present-day South Dakota, western South Dakota, where Wind Cave National Park is. And he identified this one area and thought it was good. And so Hornaday looked at the same deal. Give us the land, you fence the land, you bring in the bison. And in November 1913, I think it was, over Thanksgiving break, they loaded the bison into wooden crates in New York City. They put them on rail cars. They got an express that shot them across the country in 67 hours. And we got to Hot Springs, South Dakota, and all these trucks and wagons pulled up and they pulled the crates out. It was almost the middle of the night. The locals had built this big bonfire where the bison were going to be released, so the crews could warm up. And they let the bison out in the middle of the night. I was up in Wind Cave while I was researching this book, and if you ask at the visitor center, they'll tell you exactly where that site is, and you can go up there and walk it. And it's pretty cool. Some of the stuff that they built there, like there's a creek that goes through it, and they put like a concrete bridge that kind of sat in the creek, so the water would flow over, but they could drive the wagons over and whatnot. And you can see where the old homestead was. The buildings are gone, but you can see where they planted vegetation around the foundation and whatnot. And there's this water pump. I'm walking across, and there's this glowing object about that high. And what it was a brass water pump. I guess everybody like me whoever saw it, you go over and just kind of grab the top of it and polish it. And apparently that was for firefighting purposes. But anyway, and then we have Theodore Roosevelt, the dandy, and the dandy he was. Raised into wealth, didn't have to work a day in his life, wanted to make a man out of himself. Does anybody know where this picture was taken? Who hasn't read the book? New York City. In September of 1883, Roosevelt, determined to make a man out of himself, he'd been freshly married and they'd gone to Europe for the honeymoon. He would just, I guess the word today would be jonesing to get out into the West and test himself against the frontier and the rough cowboys and whatnot. And so in 1883, he got on board a train and went to the beeline west, and I think he went as far as he did, and when it stopped, it was in Medora, Dakota Territory, present-day Medora, North Dakota. And he got off there, and middle of the night, of course, and it was kind of cold, and went into like a dormitory hotel for men. It was kind of crazy. But one of the things he promised his wife, Alice, was that I will kill you like a bison and bring you its head. So a little more than a week after arriving in the Dakota Territory, where he had come in part to kill a bison so he could hang its mounted head in his New York City home, Roosevelt thrilled at his killing shot. Hurrah! He looked at Alice. The luck has turned at last. I will bring you home the head of the great buffalo bull and the antlers of two superb stags. I crawled up to the edge, not 30 yards from the great, grim-looking beast, and sent a shot from the heavy rifle into him just behind his shoulder, the ball going clean through his body. He dropped dead before going 100 yards. If you ever find yourself in New York City, go to Long Island to Sagamore Hill National Historic Site. And that's his home, his summer home, and you'll see that head mounted hanging in Sagamore. Now, what's interesting, Roosevelt had an epiphany as well. I mean, he had bought some ranches out there, and he would go out in the summertime. If you ever get up to Theodore Roosevelt National Park, be sure to go to the Elkhorn unit. It's not very easy to get to. You got to drive around the 90 and go up some country roads and then some Forest Service roads and get out and walk. But it's a really nice setting by the Little Missouri River. And unfortunately, his home is no longer there, but the big foundation stones are. You can walk the landscape and get the feel for what he saw when he'd be in his rocking chair on the front porch and trying to cool off under the shade. And before he'd go back to New York City, he would sit up at the flickering lantern room and wrote. And one of the things he wrote, the extermination of the buffalo has been a veritable tragedy of the animal world. You see, as he would go out there and spend summers, obviously he would get on his horse and go out hunting, and he would see what's going on with the animals. There weren't that many buffalo anymore. There weren't that many antelope. And he ran into a gentleman once who had ridden, I think it was 1,000 miles from western Montana, following the Milk River down into North Dakota. And he ran into Roosevelt and he said, all I saw were bison carcasses and skeletons. I didn't see a single live bison. So Roosevelt, he wasn't quite as on the ground active as Hornaday was, or Jones, or Goodnight. But what he did do was he urged Congress, when he was elected president, to please make this land available for the bison refuges, because we really need to save these animals. Also playing a role in the bison herds were two Montana men of mixed blood, Mikel Pablo and Charles Allard. And they had collected some bison from one of the Native Americans there, not far from Glacier National Park, probably just south of Glacier. And they turned it into a herd of about 300 or 400. And Charles Allard died in 1896, I think it was, and 11 years passed, and Allard decided, I'm gonna sell them. I can't do this anymore. And so he had about 400 bison by then. And so Hornaday saw this and said, hey, this is great. We can really improve the bloodlines of our bison. We can just get our hands on this herd. And unfortunately, the US government said, no, we really don't want them. We're not going to pay $1.25 for these bison. But the Canadians were willing. They said, sure, we'd love to have your bison. And so they sold most of the bison to the Canadian government, which took them up to Alberta, a place called Elk Island. Today it's called Elk Island National Park. Now, what's amazing I told you about how the bison from the west went back east and pointed A sent them back west. We had that one circular loop of genetic material coming back. Same thing is going on today at in Montana at the Blackfeet Reservation that borders Glacier National Park. The Blackfeet has a herd of bison, and they're really interested in building that herd, and so they've acquired some of their Elk Island bison herd. So again, you've got another genetic loop of that same genetic material that was there in the 1800s coming back to western Montana. And if things go as they're working on, one day soon those bison at Blackfoot Reservation hopefully will be roaming into Glacier National Park, and the park is really thrilled to have that possibility happen. Now, it's generally accepted today that the plains bison we have on the landscape of North America are all descended from 5 or 6 herds. Hornaday kept track, and if you go online, you can find those American Bison Society reports. And by January 1st of 1908, he had determined that there were hundreds of bison found in national parks, state parks, zoos, and private herds. His own January 1 tally showed 136 bison up in that New Hampshire herd, 240 bison left over in the Papua herd, nearly 400 up in Elk Island National Park that Hornaday really wanted, and 158 in a private herd up in South Dakota. I think he even found one in Belgium. But anyway, all the herds are descended from 5 or 6 private herds from back in the early 1900s. And what the Park Service and the Interior Department are doing now, they've been doing blood tests and genetic testing of the federal herds. I think there's 18 federal herds of bison across the West and the Midwest. Places like Badlands, Yellowstone, Grand Teton, Wind Cave, etc. And 2 years ago, when I was finalizing my manuscript, I was told that this data would be available any day. Last week I was told it would be available any day now, so they must be getting close. But they want to gather this data for 2 reasons. One, so they know exactly where their herds came from which parental herd they descended from. Because if they decide we want to put some bison over here or we want some bison over here, they want to make sure that they get a good genetic diversity. The other reason we're doing the genetic testing is to see how much cattle integration these bison might have. Cattle integration basically is this bison has cattle genes from good old Buffalo Jones and Charles Houlihan, what they're trying to do. And so they say that the Yellowstone herd is the purest bison herd out there that's got no cattle integration. The folks in Wind Cave National Park will tell you the same thing. We don't have any cattle integration in our herd. A wise scientist told me as technology improves, we're going to find cattle genes in the U.S. Now, maybe so. Today, bison are viewed as iconic animals, and they should be. I mean, really, you think about it, they should have been gone centuries ago. You know, we lost the dire wolves, we lost the American lions, we lost the saber-toothed tigers, and the bison keep on coming. You know, they've evolved, they've gotten bigger, they've gotten smaller, depending on the climate and times and whatnot. But they're still bison, they're still out there. And 2016, as you probably know, President Obama declared bison the national mammal after many years of lobbying from various groups. You can find the bison on the official logo of the Interior Department. You can find the bison on the shield of the National Park Service. And from time to time, they come into national attention for other reasons. Like just a year ago, towards the end of the partial government shutdown, you probably heard that they brought all the bison back into the parks. As rich as a history blazed by Jones, Hornaday, and Roosevelt is, so too is the history being made today thanks to the Interior Department's initiative. As I said, it was launched by Interior Secretary Dirk Kempthorne back in 2008. And they're getting close, hopefully, to having the genetic results and blood test results. Where might they go? There's really lots of places in the West and the Midwest where you can put bison. Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve over in central Colorado. If you're familiar with that place, you know that they've got bison there. What you might not know is those bison are really full of cattle genes. And so the park recently adopted a bison management plan that calls for basically wiping out those bison and then bringing in bison that aren't got any cattle genes in them. So that goes back to, we want to make sure we know where the bloodlines come from and where there's cattle in the direction. Another park that's really interested in having bison is Valles Caldera National Preserve in northwestern New Mexico. National grasslands. There are roughly 4 million acres of national grasslands in the West. Whoops, I skipped something. So I was saying they're a major article in society, and they'll stand up to anything. This was a shot from Wood Buffalo National Park in Canada. Of course, you got your wolf herd here, your wolf back here, and your bison over here saying, "Oh no, you won't. You're not going to get close to us." Just the other day, if you're on Facebook or you follow Yellowstone National Park on their website, just the other day they posted some video that one of their cameras caught on January 25th up at Old Faithful. There was a herd, it looked like about 2 or 3 dozen of bison, and they were surrounded by this wolf pack that was coming in. And you're watching this video, and it's so cool because the bison was kind of hunkered down there, and there's this one guy out on the point, and this one wolf says, "I'm going to check this guy out." Wolves will test their prey to see what they're up to. And so the wolves started going over towards the bison, and the bison didn't know that, you're not going to do that. And the bison, the tail sprang up in the air, he was on alert, and he immediately chased that wolf out of there. So anyway, I'm talking about the grasslands. I'm getting behind with my slides. There are lots of places that want bison back on the landscape. One of the places that isn't crazy about having bison back on the landscape is northern Montana. Up in northern Montana is an outfit called American Prairie Reserve, and it's a nonprofit operation whose vision is creating a nature preserve of 3.5 million acres. And their vision is to tie together public lands, like BLM grazing lands, tribal lands, private property that can be acquired, or state lands, and weave it all together into a 3.5 million acre preserve. Now, KDVR did a series on it last fall, I believe. They profiled it more as a national park. Folks in American Prairie Reserve told me it's not a national park. It's pretty cool. I went up there and I drove the landscape with it. We were looking for these 2 cow bison that had radio collars on them, and they had to replace the batteries in the radio collars. And unfortunately, they didn't start out soon enough because we never found it. But we saw some nice, elk herds and pronghorn antelope, and really just driving over that landscape. And the whole idea behind American Prairie is to save a slice of the temperate ecosystem, the temperate grassland ecosystem, which is one of the most endangered ecosystems in the world. And so, by bringing back bison, that'll help with the short grass prairie. Bison graze landscapes much different than cattle and sheep. They don't just kind of sit there and graze it down to the nubs or go over to the water hole, just kind of hang out there and trample the shorelines. They keep moving along, and they actually can create this mosaic pattern in the grass with the browsing habits. And that actually is a kind of natural fire deterrent, fire break. Today there are roughly 500,000 bison on the continent. And far and away, most of those are in commercial operations. They're raised for meat. They're raised for the robes, buffalo robes. They're raised for the skulls, ornamentation, that sort of thing. The Ute tribe has a herd down in the Book Cliffs, right up against a herd owned by the state of Utah. And the Utah herd, you can buy meat from them, you can buy robes, skull caps, whatever. But not everybody's excited. This This sign here was actually, dates back to the Obama administration, when President Obama was looking around the country, where can I establish national monuments? And there was a section in northern Montana, just north of American Prairie Reserve, that they were looking at for a prairie national monument. And the cattle ranchers, they were really concerned about that. And when American Prairie came around, they brought this sign up again. Push the wrong button. They brought the sign out again, and then, save the cowboy, stop American Prairie Reserve. What kind of strikes me as odd about that, and I don't run cattle. My father-in-law did. Ted Turner needs cowboys to run his bison. So I don't know how running bison will get rid of cowboys, but that's one of the concerns over there. Also, hope to see more bison on the landscape are the Native American cultures. There's a long history, obviously, the cultural connection between bison and Native Americans. Fort Peck tribes up in Montana, they're up there by American Prairie Reserve. They were working with the federal government and with Yellowstone for years to get permission to take Yellowstone bison that had initially been cleared of brucellosis and put them in a corral up there at the reservation and finish off the testing to make sure that they were free of brucellosis. It took years, and then just last summer, they finally got the okay to send the first batch up there and send another one up there. So they're really interested in getting more bison because, obviously for their own cultural purposes, but also there are other tribes that want bison. And Fort Peck can be the intermediary between the Yellowstone National Park bison herd and these other herds. They're there and ready to do it. They spent $1 million on their operation. Southern Utah, I mentioned down in the Book Cliffs, big bison program there. The Wind River Reservation. I was talking to a gentleman up there who runs the bison program. And, if you're familiar with our wonderful Western history, the Wind River Reservation kept shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. I mean, it went from, I don't know how big, it was huge. It covered most of Wyoming down into Colorado, Michigan. Shrinking and shrinking until now it's central Wyoming. I'm trying to remember the last bison that was killed there. It was late 1800s. And this gentleman told me that as he was doing research on the reservation, he was up in the Owl Creek Mountains and found buffalo bottles up there that had to be over a century old. And so they were thrilled. This was in 2017 as we were working on the manuscript. They had the first bison calf born on the reservation. And then this was, they got some bison from Fort Peck Indian Reservation that had gone through the process. I mentioned earlier that there's a whole lot of use that you can have out of bison. I mean, you just look at that and it's just amazing. You made arrows, you had seals, you had powders, and paints and hoodings, and the bladder was used as a cooking vessel. I mean, these people knew what to make out of what they had. And of course, dances with wolves, they had those magnificent buffalo robes. Incredible. Now, coming back home, going back to the question of where can we put bison. Coming back home from my road trip, I drove through the Thunder Basin and grassland in Wyoming. And this map really doesn't do it justice because it's over 500,000 acres. Wind Cave National Park is roughly 33,000 acres. And they have 400 bison. Imagine how many bison you put on 500,000 acres. There was a young woman who, back in 1996, did her master's thesis on returning bison to the Thunder Basin grassland. This is what it looks like. This is short grass prairie. If you ever get up there, just stop and pull over and just listen. You've got, obviously the meadowlarks and wrens, and obviously there it was raining, so the frogs were out there croaking. But you can see sandhill cranes from time to time. You could look for the bobbing heads of burrowing owls You might even see the blackbird. It's just a fascinating landscape. But, you know, just imagine what it would look like with bison on it. And of course, it's easier said than done because the grasslands were divided up into grazing allotments. And so you've got a lot of ranchers who utilize the grasslands for the cattle operations year-round. And so, yes, it's federally owned land, but turning it over into bison range would be a lot tougher. Although, bison make a rancher a lot more money than a cow would, by quite a bit. The numbers are in the book. Of course, the challenge is if you have a 2,000 head cattle operation, what's that going to cost you to turn it over into a 2,000 head bison operation? This was the middle of the night when I woke up. This was an interesting part. I don't know if any of you caught my radio spot on KPCW on Monday, but Leslie had asked me, where can you put bison? So you've got Badlands National Park over here, Wind Cave is over here, and I think the next slide shows Wind Cave. But you've got the Buffalo Gap grasslands, which goes all the way around. And you've got the Ogallala grasslands that touches the Buffalo Gap grasslands, which touches Wind Cave National Park. Theodore Roosevelt National Park is encompassed by the Little Missouri National Grasslands, which is about 1 million acres. So there's lots of room. There's lots of room. And if you ever get up to Wind Cave National Park, this is the border with Custer State Park. And I had to park there one morning and I saw this bison herd coming across. And I just got out of the car and got my camera rolling. You know, one way I'm looking at the national park, one way I'm looking at the state park. And it's just amazing. And just kind of hunkered down there. You know, they had their morning with house and we're just going to take it easy. I'm missing something. That's what I was missing. This is when I was pointing the camera towards the national park. And that's not my phone. There's a metal line. And they were determined to get someplace, and they just kind of ignored me, except for this one. Just kind of stopped looking at me, and I made sure that my car door was between me or her. So there's lots of land out there. It's just, as a society, we have to determine what we'll accept and what we won't accept. I mean, down in southern Utah in the Henry Mountains, the state of Utah was a bison herd that came from Yellowstone. The bison out on Antelope Island came from Yellowstone. There's a lot of places if we decide to do that. But at the end of the day, you might consider this message from my friends at the Midwestern region of the National Park System. Any questions? Yes, please.
So what's the difference between the bison and the buffalo?
Well, it's kind of like the difference between a fiddle and a Bison is a scientific name. Buffalo. So we're down. They're different species. But,
So the correct term is bison,
yeah.
not buffalo.
Yes.
All those grasslands that you talk about are now being used for grazing cattle. If you put bison on them and get rid of the cattle, what's that going to do to the beef prices in the grocery store?
And hopefully it'll bring down the bison prices. I think there's plenty of room for both. I mean, again, it's
But you don't want to mix them. two of them.
Well, no, you don't, but here's an interesting thing. Down the Henry Mountains, the bison will run right alongside of cattle. We've never had any cattle on the bears. Like I said, it sounds simple, but it's not as simple as it sounds.
Right.
There'd have to be a lot of coming together of minds on how it's going to be done real fast.
You're saying that bison don't tend to interbreed with cattle of their own?
Not from what I've heard. Is it?
Do you know the number of bison in Yellowstone Park?
Well, it varies throughout the year. I think one of the latest figures I saw was 4,000. What's going to be interesting to see is the past 6 months has been really exciting if you're interested in the bison. There's been a lot of things happening with the allowance of bison going up from Yellowstone to Fort Peck. A month or two ago, the state of Montana finally decided that we're going to reclassify some of the bison as wildlife. Currently, they're classified as livestock. And so not only are they going to classify them as wildlife, but they're going to let them roam in Montana. That's the good news. The bad news, they haven't decided where they're going to let them roam, and so that's going to be another delay of a few years or decades or so. So, getting back to your question, right now I think there's roughly 4,000 bison in Yellowstone, and whether this change in Montana regulations allows for the Yellowstone herd to grow more naturally will be something to watch, because they keep it down artificially because of the brucellosis issue. What's interesting about brucellosis is a bison cow, she'll lose the first fetus. She might lose the second fetus, and by the third time she gets pregnant, she usually carries it to term. Whether that happens in cattle, I don't know. But what's really interesting in Montana as well, they don't stop Yellowstone elk from coming into Montana. What they do is they really surveil the elk herds in Montana, and they actually test them for brucellosis, how much brucellosis they carry. And you've got these zones, and if elk herd with brucellosis is getting closer to a rancher, they'll notify the rancher and take whatever precautions you need to take. So it's interesting how different states and political entities deal with them. Another interesting thing going on with the Yellowstone herd right now, there's a lawsuit working its way through the court that, as I mentioned, the 23 bison that survived the great slaughter were in the Central Plateau Private Park. And there's a lawsuit now claiming that the herd in the Central Plateau and the herd on the northern range are two genetically distinct herds. And if that's true, and if they win their court case, that basically tells the Park Service, you don't have enough bison. That central herd should be 3,000 animals, and that northern herd should be 3,000 animals. So it's going to be really interesting to see what develops out of that lawsuit.
That's a good thing.
Good thing.
Do bison and cattle graze differently on open range? What are the impacts of grazing on open range?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, bison roam more, and so they don't hunt down in an area and graze into the nubs, they'll eat a little and move on. Kind of like that one video I had there from Wingate National Park. It's a little move on, they'll graze, move on. And they eat slightly different forage. They don't necessarily like all the native wildflowers. And that's one of the interesting things that the American Prairie is doing. They've had some ornithologists up there from the Smithsonian Institution looking at the bird life that is up there and looking at the nesting situation and what the bison are eating and whatnot. And one thing that's really interesting when I was up there at American Prairie, they pointed out to me, there's almost a symbiotic relationship, believe it or not, between bison and prairie dogs. Because prairie dogs are always, they pop out of their holes and normally chew down on vegetation. That spurs some vegetation to green up, always refreshing the vegetation. But bison like that. they go and munch it down. It's kind of interesting. Yes, ma'am.
So these bison, as huge as they are, they forage and eat grass, grasses and flowers all day, every day. How many pounds of food do you think you
It's in the book.
Ballpark.
It's still in the book. I want, it's somewhere between 10 and 30 pounds. Elaine, do you remember? Was that part of the dense section?
It was a part of the dense part.
You don't remember?
You just think of the landscape on Antelope Island.
Yeah.
And I'm just surprised. I'm amazed that it can sustain her.
Well, they call it.
You know what?
They call her every fall. They take animals out. So they must know what it can.
What it can support.
Like I said, Wind Cave National Park, they got about 400 bison, 35,000 acres. And, people talk about going up to Yellowstone to see bison. You ever get to South Dakota, Wind Cave, they're pretty visible there. It's pretty cool. There's a road that takes maybe an hour to drive out the loop in the park. And it's really pretty wild to go out there just to see the animals. They're really, really nice.
At this Utah festival, bison, yes, bison. Yes.
I believe it's flowers. And they actually, one of the ways they will manage to keep the population intact is through hunting licenses. And that's some commercial operations, I'm trying to remember. There are operations that enroll commercial hunts. And they'll make revenues out of it. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Kurt, and I love the book. It's good. But how about the commercial operations that are raising bison for meat in the grocery store and fancy restaurants and whatever? Is that helping with this concept of re-bisoning the landscape? Or are these animals mixed up in terms of their genetics? Or how do you look at that? How should we look at that if we're deciding whether to have a bison steak or a whatever? Impossible burger.
It's interesting, and I talked to the folks at the National Bison Association, and I talked to a geneticist, a wildlife geneticist down in Texas A&M. And he said that more and more of the commercial operations don't want to use hormones in managing their herds. They are really tilting towards more natural is better. And the National Bison Association, you can go onto their website, and they've actually got a code that they expect the members to live up to. And it goes right down the line from how to manage them to how to handle them. Don't cut their horns off. So I think there's an enlightenment going on out there, but I don't know. I think you have to like that cattle progression. I shouldn't say that because the geneticist told me it's only passed down through the mother. So if you have a bison cow that's got cattle genes, off to market.
Can you say something about the difference between the North American bison and the Eurasian bison?
A little.
A little would be good.
And I say that because at the same time, there's all this excitement in the United States about bison and putting bison back on the landscape in new places. There's an effort underway in the Carpathian Mountains of Romania, I believe, southern Romania, where they're putting bison back on the landscape. And they're the Eurasian bison, which are a little smaller than the North American bison and a little, to my eye, a little stronger. But they're having great success. I've got a contact over there. Shoot me an email whenever they've got some news to announce on a new release of bison or where they're going and whatnot. So they're pretty excited there about re-bisoning their end of the world. Anybody else?
You mentioned the disease, is that what we call wasting disease?
No,
It's different.
it's what we call Batten disease. Are you familiar with Batten disease? It's in the book. There was this hunter in ironies in my wife's hometown in Wyoming. He lives there, and he had gone up elk hunting outside of Yellowstone. And he was his buddy had killed an elk, and so they were cleaning the elk and had to quarter it, and they were getting just kind of rambunctious with their axes and whatnot. And he cut himself on the bone, but he didn't think anything about it. Until a few weeks later when he just didn't start feeling too good. And long story short, turns out he had Batten disease, and it's hard to get rid of. And apparently it's really, kind of like a bad flu, lots of aches and pains, and it just wipes out your endurance. He was tired all the time, couldn't do a lot, his strength was gone. And they put him on IV drugs for a time when he was in the hospital, and then for months and months and months, he was on antibiotics, oral antibiotics. And I had seen him, I guess it was in the late spring, early summer of 17, and this had happened back in the previous November, and he was still kind of under the weather. So yeah, it's called Batten disease.
Which we call wasting. That's
No, wasting disease is in deer.
oh. What's it elk too?
Is it-
Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is good. Anything else? Well, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.